to get sort of this holistic view of what's going on. Speaking of tweets, to some extent, all of our case studies are cross-platform studies, but the seed data for a lot of what I'm going to talk about is Twitter data because it's been public and accessible to us. So our first study where we encountered what we now know as disinformation was actually our first study of misinformation. We were looking at rumors and misinformation after the 2013 Boston Marathon bombings and during the uncertainty that happened after those events. And there were a few different rumors that we saw, we reported on them, but there was this one really weird rumor that showed up in our data. And at the time we didn't know how to make sense of it. It said the Boston bombing smells like a CIA Black Ops false flag setup. Again, don't be fooled by the mainstream media lies. And this language now, we've heard these terms, we've seen this, it almost seems like, oh, this is, you know, banal, right? Like we've already said, when we first saw this, we're like, what the hell is this? Like, what is this language? What are they talking about? Where does this come from? It was really actually a small rumor. This one wasn't even retweeted, but at the point when we went and recaptured it wasn't getting a lot of uptake, but it had some interesting features and we began to see more of it. One of the things that this kind of rumor had was it had links to a lot of different websites that at the time we weren't familiar with. In this case, this one linked to InfoWars. I will say in 2013, I didn't really know what InfoWars was. I do now, many of us do now. But this wasn't the only kind of odd website that came in this data. So we noticed that, we thought it was interesting. We didn't know quite what to make of it. And to be honest, I actually told my students, we don't really want to concentrate on this. I don't want to be a person giving talks about conspiracy theories for the rest of my life. And so we pushed it into the background and we didn't focus on this. We kept talking about rumoring and mostly accidental rumoring and sense-making processes going awry. But over time, and across events, we kept seeing this same kind of rumor show up again and again and again. They would say that it was a false flag event with hidden perpetrators, or that it was a hoax event staged by crisis actors, as they called them. Now, again, these terms are ones that now we hear all the time, or I think we do because I studied online spaces. When we first encountered them, we just thought it was the strangest thing. So what we did eventually is we decided to go back into some of this data and take a look at those different websites that were part of these conversations. And so this is actually data that we had from 2016. We waited way too long and I'm really sorry about that. But 2016, we decided to map the information ecosystem that was feeding these Twitter rumors. So we took all of the links from different tweets and we mapped user co-sharing patterns. So this graph has the domains are sized by relative to the number of tweets we had in our set that were about sort of a crisis actors rumor in 2016. And they are connected to each other when when a certain number of users, there's a threshold here, but when a certain number of users shared tweets linking two different tweets linking to two different sites, they would appear in the structure of this graph. And importantly, the red area are domains that affirm the crisis actor theory. They were spreading it. The blue are ones that were trying to correct the crisis actors and hoax theories about these crisis events. And then the yellow sites were ones that just kind of put in straight news, but often their news was used by some of the conspiracy theorists to try to support their conspiracy theorizing. So the yellow is sort of a mixed bag here. So we mapped this out, you know, I saw the structure, and after I created the graph, I actually conducted content analysis of the different web domains, manual content analysis. I just went in and started reading content from these strange websites that I hadn't seen before. And I don't necessarily recommend this because it took me months to recover, and it was so disorienting, it took me months to recover. So that analysis revealed the ecosystem to be supporting a variety of different conspiracy theories and pseudoscientific claims. These topics didn't just appear in one site or one thing. Most of these domains had all of these different topics appearing in some article. They weren't just covering one conspiracy theory, they were covering all of them. So they became this sort of like catch-all for this, this kind of content. The content, it was critical of Western governments, it was anti-media, anti-science. It consistently reflected what we're now talking about as populist ideologies and very strong anti-Semitic themes. And we could see, you know, the conversation around pedophile rings that we're hearing again, it was already kind of in this ecosystem in 2016 as something that they were really focused on. And then deep state kind of conversations and what becomes the foundations of QAnon were already sort of present in some of these conversations. And we can talk, Sunstein and Vermeulen have talked about this as sort of as people beginning to develop a corrupted, or they call it crippled, I call it a corrupted epistemology, where once you believe one of these conspiracy theories, you are more likely to believe another. And so there's this kind of gateway effect that may be happening from one conspiracy to another. But there's also this structural effect where once somebody goes into this website to see one conspiracy theory, they're going to see all these others as well. And so we begin to think about this alternative media ecosystem that's active in spreading misinformation, conspiracy theories, and even disinformation as part, as a sort of toxic vector of what increasingly we're seeing as disinformation. So this alternative media ecosystem is made up of clickbait sites, hyperpartisan media, gray propaganda sites, and it spreads many, many conspiracy theories. We actually did find sites like RT, Sputnik, and some other sites associated with Russian disinformation that were in the red area. And increasingly we've seen similar ones again and again in other similar kinds of conversations. And so this intersection between conspiracy theorizing and spreading political disinformation is happening in this ecosystem as well. Stepping back from that, we can see that disinformation campaigns actually use conspiracy theories as tools to achieve their objectives. And disinformation, as sort of theorized by Pomerantsev and Weiss, I think it's a really good way to think about it. Disinformation isn't necessarily meant to convince somebody of something, but to confuse, to create muddled thinking across society, with this idea that the society that doesn't know where it can go for trusted information is one that's easily manipulated and may turn towards more authoritarian kinds of leadership. I think that's a good foundation, although I'm going to continue to build on some of our understanding of disinformation as we go. One thing I want to point out here is that conspiracy theories and disinformation about COVID-19 are spreading through and across the same alternative media ecosystem, and actually through a lot of some of the same actors. And not just that one, we've mapped a similar one in different kinds of events. This other one is from the Syrian conflict, another disinformation ecosystem. And some of these same sites activated to spread claims that COVID-19 is a hoax, or that the real cause is 5G technologies. And unfortunately, the communities that rely on this content and spread it are actually growing online. We can see, I don't know if any of you saw the Plandemic video that contained a lot of conspiracy theories about COVID-19. We actually watched it spread from anti-vaccine communities into the conspiracy theory communities that have been converging around QAnon, and then through hyper-partisan far-right media and into more kind of mainstream pro-Trump MAGA kind of communities in Twitter and also in Facebook as well. So we can see that these communities are actually, where in the Boston Marathon bombings, this content was small and sort of marginal. Now this content is a very large part of what's going on in the information ecosystem. All right, I'm gonna take a little breath here and then move on to case study 2. So case study 2, I play around with different case studies for different times and different presentations, but I think this is really critical going into the 2020 election, is another kind of look back at disinformation during the 2016 election. And my colleagues and I, my students and I did a study on this. So we were actually looking at, we actually came in not trying to study mis or disinformation. This was a different study. I had a student who wanted to look at Black Lives Matter organizing online. And so he took the lead on a study, and he mapped out sort of, we were looking at framing of different conversations, both among pro Black Lives Matter activists and sort of this counter movement of people that were trying to denigrate the Black Lives Matter message, so the Blue Lives Matter and All Lives Matter movement. We mapped out the different conversations of people who were using Black Lives Matter and Blue Lives Matter in their tweets. And not surprising, this is a retweet network graph, and the edges are removed, but nodes are Twitter accounts, and they're closer together if they retweeted each other and further apart if they didn't. And we can see here, not surprisingly, this conversation is highly polarized. And it clumps out into two different sections. And on the left, we have sort of pro Black Lives Matter accounts that were supportive of the Black Lives Matter message. And on the right, we had anti-Black Lives Matter and pro Blue Lives Matter messaging. And so we actually published a study on this, talked about how the different sides were using Twitter in different ways. And in some ways talked about the conversation being very divisive and other kinds of things. We mapped out the influencers and whatever. So we published this in 2017 in November. 2 weeks after we published it, Twitter, working with the US Congress in 2017 November, released a list of Twitter accounts that were associated with the Internet Research Agency in Russia, who we now know was running information operations targeting US populations around the 2016 election. And so they released a list of accounts that they had used some different information to figure out that they were coming from the Internet Research Agency. And I took a look at that list of accounts one night. I remember it being nighttime, and I went through it, and I was like, oh my gosh, I recognize some of the names on these accounts. I recognize them from our research on the Black Lives Matter conversation. And so I sent the list over to my student. I said, hey, can you go map this out for me? Where are the accounts in our network? And the student sent it back the next morning, a graph that looked almost exactly like this. And I said, oh, that's not the right graph. That can't possibly be it. And he said, no, that's the right graph. And so what it showed actually, and I think we're not surprised by this now, at the time we may have been surprised, is that the Russian Internet Research Agency had infiltrated both sides of the conversation of Black Lives Matter and were participating. These are retweets of their network there. In some cases, they were influencers on either side, and they had become part of the conversation. My PhD student, Emre Arif, conducted in-depth qualitative research on the accounts in orange, and he found that the IRA accounts enacted multidimensional online personas across platforms that played on the stereotypes of African Americans on one side and white US conservatives on the other. They were impersonating activists and modeling for others what online activism looked like, reflecting norms, but also to some extent shaping the online norms about how we have conversations. Often their content wasn't superficially problematic or any different from what others in the space were doing. They were tweeting about strong Black voices on the left or support of US veterans on the right. You could see them cultivating audiences for future strategic messaging. In other places, they were sowing and amplifying division. Some of their content was among the most vitriolic content in the space, advocating for violence against police on the left and using racial epithets on the right. In a few cases, we can actually see the IRA Russian trolls holding arguments with themselves, like a puppeteer, having one of their accounts on the left fight with one of their accounts on the right. So stepping back, we can look at this as a multi-year campaign to infiltrate and shape political discourse in the United States, orchestrated by a group with ties to the Russian government. And we can see them burrowing into and working within, and in some cases working with, these otherwise organic online communities. And though we think that we're probably a little bit more resilient to this in this cycle from foreign infiltration, we can see domestic operations and others using these same tactics right now, right? So we know this is continuing. We know that we're vulnerable to spreading disinformation when we engage online within our political identities. That's a time where we're manipulated to become part of a disinformation campaign unknowingly. And so we know that's a vulnerability. And we also know that across history, and certainly in 2016, and I think it's going to be ongoing, and that online activist communities are specifically targeted by disinformation campaigns, both foreign and domestic. We've seen this with Black Lives Matter and Blue Lives Matter. We've seen it with veterans communities, LGBT communities. We've seen it with MAGA groups. That these disinformation actors are impersonating Americans, infiltrating our online communities, and trying to shape our discourse towards their objectives. And they're not just foreign agents, they're domestic ones as well. And it's something that I think is something for reflection as we're thinking about platform design, which I'll get back to later. All right, so stepping back again, thinking about disinformation. Disinformation isn't just an orchestrated campaign from someone else. It's often participatory and collaborative, where the people that are targeted can start to take up the messages and begin to seed and sustain the campaign themselves, even after the orchestrated elements leave. So we're seeing that more and more in online spaces. It's very hard to distinguish between active measures and activism, especially as the activists themselves in certain networks begin to use disinformation techniques to advance their own objectives. So disinformation can be orchestrated, it can be cultivated. In some cases, it can start to become organic from online networks, and it becomes really hard to disentangle those pieces, and it becomes a real challenge for the platforms and for policy as well. All right, so my last set of examples comes from some more recent things around COVID-19. These are not fully baked examples. They're not yet in peer review. One of them we published through a public blog, but I want to talk a little bit about this. Is something a lot of folks I think are working on. We care about how science is being politicized, weaponized, and diminished within the space of COVID-19 and how people are talking about it. So we can look at a couple examples. Here's one that I ended up seeing. I posted something with a sort of data memo about the 5G rumors, about how they were spreading online. And in the comments of one of that post, maybe I talked to a journalist, but in the comment, someone posted this article, which we now know has been retracted. But there was an article that someone pushed out through a preprint or somehow that was essentially making these claims. So here, the claims are that the symptoms of COVID-19 are not from the coronavirus; they actually come from 5G cell towers. And it's so not surprising, because as someone who's been studying these ecosystems, we've seen 5G cell towers and other kinds of technologies blamed for other things in the past. So it's just kind of almost like the repetition of and slight twist of an old narrative applied to COVID-19. But what's interesting here is that as they were trying to push this, they actually pushed out a scientific article, to give their content the credibility of science. And even though the article was retracted, it doesn't stop the trolls and the people from believing this from placing links to this paper in the comments of every article criticizing their conspiracy theories. So they're trying to use science and use some of the weaknesses of science right now, including the preprint technique, to support conspiracy theorizing. And also, as it does that, it erodes, I think, trust in science more broadly, which is a problem as well. There's another case here of the Chinese scientist who claims she had proof that COVID-19 was created in a lab. One of my family members sent me this New York Post article. I think it was published September 11 of this year. It came out of New York Post, which is a conservative news outlet that does have that leaning. A few days later, a preprint paper appeared in an online repository, which was later heavily criticized by other scientists in this space. So before that article was retracted, and prior to eventually this scientist appears on Fox News to further publicize her claims. My colleague Carl Bergstrom pointed out that the paper was released by a research institute, which is directed by political operative Steve Bannon, who also used to be a campaign director and then part of the campaign director for Trump in 2016, and then part of the Trump administration. And so we have this political operative creates a research institute and promotes a scientist to write a paper that gets a preprint and then pushed out on conservative media, and then is later either retracted or something else. So again, they're using the preprint process. Political operatives are weaponizing science in this case to try to spread what seems to be a politically motivated theory or conspiracy theory about the origins of COVID-19. Certainly, if we have information on the origins of COVID-19, I think it's important for us to learn those things. But here we have like political operatives trying to shape the scientific, they're trying to use science to shape the public's opinion of what's going on, because they don't take it through the scientific process. They took it straight to the media. So that's another piece of the problem. So those are kind of some light cases. I want to go a little bit further into this case, which is the case that I know the best because we've done some analysis of it. And this was actually an article that was published on Medium by a person with very low number of followers, not a lot of attention to him, in March 20. The article was presenting sort of selective data and scientific studies about COVID-19. It was arguing that social distancing measures were an overreaction. So March 20, the social distancing measures had just gone into place in the United States. We were just about to go into a wave of a lot of deaths because people were getting sick around the country. The author of the article was a co-founder of a political nonprofit organization that says a community of center-right technologists who utilize their tech skills to advance liberty in the public square. And the article, as I said, was published on March 20, when a lot of conservative pundits were pushing for a quick reopening. And President Trump would actually announce a couple of days later that the US would be open by Easter, which was a few weeks after that. So this article starts really slowly, but it ends up receiving millions of views on Medium. About 24 hours. About 24 hours later, my colleague Carl debunked this, or he went through and actually criticized piece by piece all the points that the article was making, showing how the article was misinterpreting and misrepresenting the data and the science to kind of argue for this particular narrative. And indeed, after some of that criticism went viral, Medium actually chose to apply a policy and take that article down, but not before it received millions of views per the author's count. And then the author later notes and starts pushing out that the site Zero Hedge had picked up his article. And interestingly enough, Zero Hedge is a website we've repeatedly seen in our alternative media ecosystem. It's actually often echoed specifically Russian disinformation. We saw it in the MH17 data around the downing of that airliner over Ukraine. So we see this kind of intersection again with this getting picked up and being politically useful and spreading through the alternative media ecosystem. But what's interesting for us is to look a little bit more closely at how this article sort of went viral. And we're going to do that through the Twitter data because that's the best we have. We actually can't see exactly what's happening on Medium. But if we look, this is a graph technique we've been using to understand attention dynamics about how something spreads and who helps it spread on Twitter. X-axis is the time, and the majority of this article's propagation happens in about 24 hours. So by the end of that, by where it's at about 15,000 there, that's about 24 hours after it was initially shared, a little longer. The y-axis is a number of tweets linking to the article, total number of tweets linking to the article, and then individual tweets are plotted on this graph, and specifically they're plotted. So red circles are original tweets where someone writes a tweet and then links off to that article. Red diamonds are quote tweets where they're quoting someone else, they're retweeting with a comment of someone else, and blue circles are just retweets of someone else's tweet linking to this article. Not super important. Tweets are sized relative to the size of the author's audience, their number of followers. And so what you can see here is that first, down here in the left corner, the misleading article wasn't getting much uptake, but all of a sudden it begins to take off, and that takeoff happens after several large follower accounts tweet and retweet the content. So what's going on there? So we actually can do this. We have an interactive graph we use, but I've overlaid this one so you can see. So what actually happened was a series of cable news pundits for the conservative Fox News channel and began to tweet and retweet it when they woke up the morning of the next day after it had been published. So we don't know how it came onto their desk, but we can see them retweeting and retweeting, and that's when this article really starts to go viral. Now, eventually this content gets corrected. So Brian Stetler, that really bright red tweet up there is actually 2 tweets in a row where he's actually correcting some of these pundits. And actually some of the pundits themselves would later correct themselves, delete their tweets and say that the article had been debunked and removed and it probably wasn't good information. But that was too late it already had all these views and people had already read it. So it already affected people that may have been interested in the content. So we can see the intersection here between political motivations, attention dynamics, and misleading representations of science. And this is just one case. We could do this case over and over and over again in the context of COVID-19. There's so many cases where different things are going viral with the help of influencers that have political motivations. All right, so stepping back again and kind of going into the last part of this talk, I want to think about the implications of some of these cases. And the first thing I want to think about is how disinformation distorts the information environment. And we keep seeing this in data after data after data. Like every time we go in, we can't even see, who are the real people and what are they talking about? Right now it's so difficult to work out because there's so many different information operations and campaigns. And then social media influencers who have gained prominence through the use of all these techniques are now, have these huge audiences. And so when we're looking at the data, and even when we're looking at our own feeds, I can start to perceive like how the things that we're seeing are often distorted by what's happening in terms of information operations and what's already happened. These operations have already reshaped the networks. They've already helped, you know, different accounts gain prominence. This guy here that pushed out this content, the Medium post, his number of followers went from 4,000 to 20,000 overnight, and he's continued to grow, right? So this sent him off, and he becomes now an influencer himself. And we see this happen over and over again. So we can see like these disinformation campaigns can distort the information environment and make it hard for us to even make heads or tails of what's going on there. And as a person experiencing this environment, that distortion is becoming part and shaping how they see the world. Pervasive disinformation, regardless of the intentions of those who wield it, is a threat to democracy. It targets the hearts and minds of a population. It can shape their perceptions of reality in ways that align with someone else's objectives. I mean, that's the theory behind disinformation in terms of how it's deployed. And certainly we can see evidence that may be what's taking place here. I don't want to overscare us. I think there's things we can do about it, but this is certainly, and the reason it's a threat specifically to democracy is it undermines trust in information providers. So think about that first tweet from the Boston Marathon bombings. Don't trust the mainstream media, right? The mainstream media lies. It undermines trust in institutions, in government institutions. Think about our opinion right now of the CDC and how much it's changed since a year ago. It undermines trust in elections. It undermines trust in each other. It begins to pull us so far apart that it destabilizes the common ground that democratic societies need to stand upon to govern themselves. And that can lead us towards more authoritarian kinds of leadership. One thing I added just this morning, based on conversations we've had, and we've also done some analysis of this particular tweet, is that disinformation can arrive from the margins of the internet, but it also can be spread from the top down. But it also can be spread from the top down, from political leaders and other influencers. This is a tweet from Donald Trump, sent about a month ago. He said a few of these, often on weekend mornings. It functions to sow unfounded confusion and fear in mail-in drop boxes, in particular this tweet. Other ones seem to be attacking mail-in ballots more generally. It supports this tweet supports a broader narrative that mail-in ballots are a big fraud, and it's one of dozens of similar tweets the account has posted over the past few months. Twitter even took action on this one. Twitter's policies have been evolving very quickly this summer. I'll be happy to talk about them. And they've begun to take action. In this case, they added a warning label to it, and they actually took out the retweet button so that it couldn't spread after a certain point. Although it was a little too late by the time they did it, so I'm not sure that had a lot of effect. But here we can see misleading information about voting designed to undermine trust in election results. And this is a form of disinformation that also undermines democracy at its foundations. And I think people are becoming more aware of how this is a threat to democracy, but I'm not sure that there's any idea of what we can do about it as a society. I was invited here for a reason. I've never thought of myself as a cybersecurity person, but others have been telling me that what we've been working on is a cybersecurity thing, and I think I'm going to accept that you're right. I think we're thinking about cybersecurity beyond just hacking the machines, but thinking about hacking the system, the socio-technical system as a whole, to try to change how people see the world, because so many of us are relying on these information systems to help us figure out what's going on. And if those information systems are distorted, that distortion becomes part of reality. So there's a possibility for disinformation to manipulate populations at scale, and I think it is a major cybersecurity issue. And getting to this last part, what can we do? And there's a couple of different directions, and I'm going to go through these really quickly, but I think one of the things we can do is think about education design. How do we help people become healthier, more productive online participants? When I think about this, I'm not thinking about high school classes or even college curriculum. I think that's an important part of it, but I really do think this is a K through 99 issue. And so how do we help our elders, ourselves, people across the age spectrum to understand these emerging threats and to kind of become savvier participants in these spaces and maybe not be so vulnerable. I think the platforms have a long way to go to help keep online communities safe, and to help them to, on the moderation side, better detection and tools to address manipulation and distortion quickly and at scale. On the user experience side, I think they can be giving better informational cues to help users better assess accounts, articles, and domains. When we first encountered some of those crazy domains, there was no cues around them that they were any different from any other kind of domain. Even as they were leading people down the rabbit hole, there was no cue that any browser or any social media company was giving that this domain wasn't the same as the Guardian or or the Seattle Times or something else. The only difference is the content was free on the ones that were taking them down the rabbit hole, so it was easier to access. Also, the platforms could give, yes, right, cover that. The other thing is policy design and the platform. I'm thinking platform policies right now, and there has been a lot of innovation here. They're doing a bit better on this, first with COVID-19, and I think election 2020 as well. But there's a long way to go, and it's a lot of responsibility. We can talk about that too, perhaps too much responsibility for individual platforms to be making these decisions when the stakes are so high, but right now that's all we have. And so I do think there's a role for them to continue to innovate there, and for us to support them in that innovation, to help them, to guide them, to make good decisions about how to respond, and how to create policies that allow them to quickly respond. Because if you wait 4 hours to take effect on Trump's tweet, it's too late. It's already affected. It's already spread through hundreds of thousands and possibly millions of accounts. The last thing I know my talks can be really depressing and kind of scary. So I actually have this little story. I was sitting on a panel in Washington, D.C. a few years ago, and there were a few of us on the panel. They were saying the same things and just talking about how all these things were hard problems and going to be hard to solve. And at the end of our talks, this ambassador got up and he scolded us. And he said, we've faced hard problems before. We've had the Cold War, there was a threat of nuclear holocaust and things. And we were able to get through it. And we didn't get through it by like we took one little pin out and the old thing fell down. We didn't get through it by like one simple solution, but we chipped away. We chipped away at the problem from all sorts of directions. And I think that's what we have to do as an academic, as a research community and research communities, is think about how to chip away these problems from all the different places until we slowly kind of make our way out of this. I do think these are critical problems that are being faced by people all over the world. I do think it's pushing us towards more authoritarian leadership in a lot of different places. And I think it's going to be, it's a real challenge, but I have hope that as research communities and journalists and everyone can kind of come together in different ways and start chipping at this problem to try to solve it. And I'm hopeful. I'm not confident, but I'm hopeful. And with that, I'm going to end the slideshow. Thank you all for your time. Thank my students and collaborators. Figure out where the stop share is. Figure out how to get out of here. And maybe take questions.
Well, I think I'll speak for everyone when I say that was an awesome talk, Kate. That was really,
thanks,
really informative and entertaining. Yes, so if anyone has questions for Kate, I mentioned this at the outset, but I'm just going to go through it in a little bit more painstaking detail. The two ways of asking a question are, in Whova, next to your presentation, there's a tab that says Session Q&A. If you click on that, you can type out a question by clicking the Ask a Question button at the bottom. Or if you would like to ask a question sort of in Zoom with your own voice, you will want to click on the Participants button at the bottom of your Zoom window, and that will open up with an opportunity to raise your hand. It's a little blue hand, and if your blue hand is raised, then we can go through, unmute you, you can ask your question, and then Kate will give a great response, I'm sure. So as people are figuring out those systems, I will start with one of the questions we already have in Whova, which asks, should the US government do more to regulate content providers, and what would that look like?
That's such a hard question right now, because I think the trust in the current government, based on, and from both sides of the political spectrum, and all sides, there's more than two sides. I think there's not a lot of trust in government. I do think we've got this situation where individual platforms that are not, we have these democratic societies that are supposed to be governing ourselves. And then there are these platforms that are outside of our democratic governance that have so much power in what's happening in our country and around the world. and we as a society have very little ability to govern them right now. So I do think there's opportunity going forward, but right now we're at such a difficult point with distrust, no common ground, both sides pointing fingers at each other. But I don't see hope in the next couple of years for the two sides to come together in a way that the country will, like, that the population will buy into that regulation. And so we're leaving the companies, where the companies actually have more trust right now than the government. And so if you were going to put a policy in place from our government right now on social media platforms, I would probably be critical of it. But I think that there has been some success in the European Union. Has done some stuff that I think is really beneficial across different things, although it's been difficult for researchers because it's made our lives harder, but I think that's a good thing. So I do think there's place for policy. I just think in the US right now, I just don't see how it's going to work.
Sure, thanks. And I'm not seeing any blue hands raised just yet, so I will grab the next from the Q&A, which asks, what is the role of AI in detection and spread of disinformation on social media?
Yeah, I'm not an AI skeptic. I think there's a role for AI, but I do, from my own experience in research and also from a little experimentation and then a lot of reading, I do think like human in the loop solutions are the only ones that are really going to work for some of these things. The bad actors are innovating at all times. We've got AIs actually going to make things harder with the GPT-3 stuff. Like, that content is going to make it even more difficult to detect whether something's authentic versus not. And so yeah, to moderate these platforms at scale and have the platforms be able to make enough money to exist, I think they are sort of going to have to be able to rely on AI, but it's going to have to get better. And I do think that they're also going to have to invest more human resources in there. I do think we're going to need people to help calibrate, train that AI, and to do a lot of the interpretation at the end of the day for some of the edge cases, because that's where the hard stuff happens.
Sure. All right, we have a live question now from Vaughn Welch.
Hi, Kate. Thank you for that really informative and timely talk. Maybe a question out there a little bit, but if one of the NSF science projects sees misinformation flying around about their particular area of science, or maybe even about their particular area of work, is there something in particular you think they could do?
I don't know what the action I would recommend to do. I will describe the problem is that good science works at a pace that kind of traps us, where bad science can move faster and it goes directly to the journalists and goes out to the world, and good science is waiting for peer review or is trying to do things the right way. And so the question is, how do we communicate well, quickly, and through whom when you see something like that happening? I do think we have a situation where journalism recognizes that there's a role for them to play a little bit in this, and good journalists are recognizing where they've played the wrong role and sort of amplifying bad science. For me, when I see something right now, I'm like, okay, who are we gonna call to tip off that this is happening so they can get the message out there? And sometimes that's like a platform so they can take action, and sometimes that's like a journalist and say, hey, we're seeing this. We really think it should be a story. This is why it's wrong. And this, so unfortunately it does involve, like, how do you reach the public fast enough to catch up with misinformation spreads halfway around the world by the time that the truth has its shoes on or whatever. Like, and I think science faces that problem. I mean, it's even harder for science, because science is really, it's just thinking about which shoes to put on. It hadn't even started to tie them. So it's a good question.
All right, thanks, Vaughn. If anyone else has an in-person question, again, you can just raise your hand. Also, in the Q&A tab, you are able to vote on the questions that are already there, so it won't just be me picking the one I like the best. If you all have a question you think is really important to ask, because I think now we have too many questions and I'm just not going to be able to get to them all to ask Kate. So another question asks, what method or methods do you engage in to enhance public trust in accurate information? and to promote empirical critiques of popular claims?
I can't answer all of that, but from our group, the thing that we do to enhance public trust in our work is to get the evidence out there. One of the things that we've done a lot of is we'll get the peer review, we'll publish, especially the early disinformation work, we'll publish in an academic conference or journal, and then we will do the translation into a public facing article or blog that makes sure that we're communicating things with the limitations and make sure that they're present, because we know that they can sometimes get, we can lose those in the translation to journalism. And then just using the data relying very heavily on the data to demonstrate, like, this is where it's coming from. We have the data, we have the receipts. That's not true for all kinds of research. Sometimes it doesn't work that way. I think we can communicate some of what we do in a way that the public can understand. And other kinds of science may not have that benefit because it involves things that people maybe can't get their head wrapped around. But for us, it really is about trying to be very careful about how we communicate, and often trying to get our stuff out first in our own hand in a public facing format. And then if there's an opportunity, we can talk to a journalist later, but we can keep referring back to, no, this is the content. And even an academic paper may not be as accessible. So we kind of try to put something in the middle to do that translation. I'm not sure that totally answers the question, but that's certainly, that's the small answer on that. I think there's a broader answer to think about, how do we enhance trust in science more generally? And that's something I don't have the answer to, but it's certainly something we're all discussing.
Sure, yeah, it's a hard problem. We probably have time for maybe one or two more questions. One of them asks, have you been thinking, or have you already been dealing with disinformation on social media that is in a different language than English, and how that might affect those populations?
Yeah, I mean, our research has been limited because we rely so much on qualitative methods. We rely on the language skills of the researchers we have. And for the most part, we've done English-based studies, although we've had some researchers that have allowed us to take into other places. I think that's a huge gap in a lot of the research. There are some great studies in the context of the Philippines, India, Brazil, but in terms of the number, there's just not as many, and we don't understand. And they have different platforms that they're using, and the problems are actually different based because the platform affordances are so different. So I do think there are the science right now on disinformation is limited because it's too focused on English, and we really need to be expanding to other kinds of languages and geographies.
Okay, and let me just apologize to everyone. I realized that my browser was not showing the upvotes. You all were upvoting, and the most upvoted question by far is, well, great presentation, and people asking if there's a way they can share it with their colleagues somehow.
Yeah, I mean, we can talk about that later. I have not yet released these, but I don't see that they're any different from other presentations that I've made public, except for the last one, and I've talked about that in the Washington Post. So yeah, I don't think it would be a problem to make it public. So I can either share the slides maybe to start with, and then we'll have to talk about sharing the recording.
Perfect. All right, and we've got about 2 minutes left, so I'll go ahead and ask what I'll say is the final question, which I think is now the currently most upvoted that hasn't been asked, which is, what's your opinion of open source efforts like r/massmove that try to identify sources of misinformation and disinformation?
I think of this moment as kind of an all hands on deck. The chip away, I think, is a broad one. I think there has been some great innovation and some great work done by open source kinds of communities. There's always that risk that, you know, it's all about standards, right? When you open it up to a crowd, you can make mistakes. But I think if we can put that in context, that mistakes can happen, and that those crowds themselves may be infiltrated and other kinds of things. But when I think of something like online mis and disinformation around vaccines or something else, we as a society are not going to be able to address that with a top-down methodology. We really have to address it with a bottom-up, with people talking to each other, with this coming. So when the attack is a network distributed attack, I think that a network distributed defense is probably well matched. So I would actually be encouraged to see those, with the idea that they can also be led, they'll probably make mistakes, but I don't think it's bad to have that kind of activity in this space too. It's an all hands on deck moment.
Great, thanks. Well, once again, let me lead everyone in a virtual round of applause for Kate. That was a great talk and great questions and answers. We are now going to take a 15-minute break. We will reconvene at 2:45 Eastern. I would suggest everyone, before you take your break, just go ahead and move into the next Whova presentation, just so you're ready for it. And we will close out this presentation. So once again, Kate, thank you.
All right, thank you. Thank you for your time.